have to contain myself. I'm very excited to have Leslie Kaminoff here today to talk to us. I'll just say a few things about Leslie. Leslie is a best-selling author and a yoga educator. He has over 40 years of experience specializing in the individualized application of breath-centered, inquiry-based practice. He's the co-author of Yoga Anatomy. I'll hold up my old edition here. Leslie has
Here's
the
the
new
current
one.
one. That's the second edition. This is the third edition. So also available in spiral bound. This is a new thing,
Ooh, that's
right?
very
Yeah.
nice. That's
Yeah.
great because then you can just, yeah, because I'll just bend mine.
Yeah.
Well, and it should be noted that this is an amazing book, and in its very first print, it sold out of its first print in like a month. Isn't that true? Like, was
Well,
like,
yeah, they got caught short. They weren't expecting it to sell out so quickly, so they had to catch up with the second printing. So there was a lot of demand in the market for a book like this, and it's been selling pretty well ever since. That was in
yeah,
2007 when it first came out. Yeah.
amazing. And I think it said it's something like over 500,000 copies sold, which is just
No, no. Well, that was when I
extraordinary.
wrote that bio you're reading, which is a little out of date. It's actually over a million.
Oh,
It's
oh my
actually
God, really?
it's over a million at the, well, see here. Yeah. So over 1 million copies sold. It's official.
It's official.
Yeah.
Amazing. And I also want to mention Leslie is the founder of the Breathing Project, which is where I first heard about Leslie years ago when I first did my first little baby teacher training in New York
Mm.
City in like 2003, 2004. People were whispering about the Breathing Project, which was a New York City based nonprofit educational corporation, which ran highly respected year-long courses in yoga anatomy from 2003 to 2017. And now those courses, even though the Breathing Project has been closed down or has been
Mm.
discontinued, now those courses are available at yogaanatomy.net. And
Yeah.
thousands of students from all over the world can come and participate in those classes. And
That's true.
yeah,
Yeah.
I know. And Leslie, I've heard Leslie's name for, again, it's been 20 years that I've heard about Leslie Kaminoff. And you're just a pillar in yoga society. When I think about yoga and the lineage, you come to mind as one of our respected leaders. So I'm very excited to talk to you.
Yeah.
So,
Well, if a pillar is something that's, rather upright and stiff and doesn't bend very well, then yeah, that's where I'm at this point in my career.
what? You're not a massively flexible yoga person?
I
What?
used to be a lot more massively flexible when I was younger. If I tried to
Mm,
practice now the way I was doing in my 20s, I'd put myself straight into the emergency room.
you know,
But that's part of what we'll probably talk about is how
yeah,
practice has to be modified for people's situation and their age and their condition. And that was a
yeah.
big sort of principle of my teacher, Desikachar.
Yes, and this is one of the things that I'm so excited about. In addition to just introducing any of you who don't know Leslie, to introduce you to Leslie, but also because Leslie was the student of Desikachar, and Desikachar is the son of Krishnamacharya. And this is just a huge part of our yoga history and our yoga lineage that folks, I think it's great for us to hear about and know more about. But first, let me talk about you just a little bit. Would you mind share? I mean, how did you get into yoga, Leslie? How did that happen?
Well, actually, I was invited to take a yoga class by my father. He was experiencing at the time, and the year would have been 1978, so I was 20, and he was 48. So he was having a midlife crisis and trying to get his act together and trying to get healthy. And one of the things he was doing as part of that was yoga, and that was here in New York City. And he invited me to take the class where he was studying, which was at the Shivananda Yoga Center, which is still in the same place it was back then in 24th Street. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the Shavasana. Um, I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of people were sort of transformed by their first deep relaxation experience, and so pretty soon after that, I signed up for a beginner's course, and by that next summer of '79, I was up north in Canada doing a teacher's training course at the headquarters of the organization, um,
Wow.
north of Montreal. Yeah.
So Shivananda training.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
And to this day, I believe that as an organization, they're probably responsible for the training of more yoga teachers than any other
Mm.
on the planet. And it's a month-long experience at an ashram. You know, you sleep in a tent and do yoga and meditation twice a day, and eat the
Mhm.
vegetarian food and study the philosophy. And that's all I was interested. I was interested in just having a month-long experience of doing that. I had no real intention of teaching or turning it into a lifelong career, but it just sort of one thing led to another. And here we are. It's, what is it, 45 years later, and 46 years later. This summer, it'll be
Mhm.
46 years since I did that teacher training. So, yeah.
Wow. So one thing led to another. Can you tell us a little bit more about the one thing leading to another?
Sure. Well, I had some skills going into my ashram experience. I had been um, active in theater production, actually, which I studied in high school. I went to the High School of Art and Design here in New York, and later, while I was still in high school, was working on off and off Broadway productions as like a
Oh.
stage manager, and so.
Mm.
That summer of 79, when I did my teacher's training, right after the teacher's training, they were planning this huge festival in August called the Festival of Inner Light, where all of these guests were coming in and, presenters from all over the world. And they needed a stage. So I stayed on after my teacher's training and helped them build the stage. And
Mm.
at some point, I asked who the stage manager was going to be. They didn't even know what a stage manager was. So you know how you kind of rise to the level of your skill and competence pretty quickly in these situations, and
Mm.
and so I just started doing kind of technical support work for not just the festival but other events. I ended up being on staff for a while in the Bahamas at the retreat on Paradise
Oh,
Island,
yeah.
and eventually I got sent to India to support a teacher's training course that was happening there, and that would have been in January of 1981.
Wow.
And it was there that I took sannyas, so I became a swami rather quickly. It was a very much a fast track thing for me. I didn't go through the usual, many years of brahmacharya and all of that. I basically annoyed Swami Vishnudevananda enough that he gave me the sannyas to more or less shut me up. Um, and so by the spring of 81, I was back in the States and I was transferred to Los Angeles to be the director of the center there, which was actually in West Hollywood. And so for a couple of years, I was actually running that place. It was right on Sunset Strip, very interesting location to have a yoga community.
Wow. What does being a Swami entail? Like, what does that mean?
It's like becoming a monk or a priest, similar. You take vows of poverty and obedience and celibacy. Um, and the experience that I had was that, like, when you announce to the world that you've renounced all of these things start coming back at you like 100 times stronger than you had ever
Mm.
imagined they could. In my case, the poverty thing was that I was now, when you become a Swami in that organization, you kind of get kicked up to upper management, right? And so you're often put in charge of centers, and that's exactly what
Mm.
happened to me. And so I was handling more money than I'd ever seen before. I was,
Mm.
managing purchasing and paying rent and collecting rent from the residents, and so I
Mm.
had that experience, and the obedience thing was. Technically, had taken a vow of obedience to the guru, who was Swami Vishnudevananda, the founder of the organization, and but he was off doing his peace missions and flying his plane. He was known as the Flying Swami, so he was flying these missions over like Northern Ireland and the Suez Canal, and doing his thing. And so he's off doing his thing. And so the center directors were very much autonomous in the sense of decision making, and everyone who was sort of working and living at the community had to answer to me. So people had to be obedient to me. And I
Mm.
was like, 23 years old with all of this responsibility.
Wow.
And as far as the celibacy thing is concerned, um, there is apparently nothing more attractive to members of the opposite sex than someone that's taken a vow of celibacy.
Of
So
course.
I thought I was done with that dynamic just by wearing orange and taking vows. I was just sorely mistaken. So anyway, I realized that it was not that the celibacy swami thing was not my path after about
Right.
9 months of that, and so
Mm.
stayed on as the center director after renouncing my renunciation. But then I left the organization and I stayed in Los Angeles, and that's when I started working in sports medicine because
Mm.
I was living with a woman at the time who was my girlfriend and an athlete and connected to the whole sports medicine community, and this turned out to be really interesting timing because in Los Angeles at that time, we're talking about like 1982 at this point, everything was gearing up towards the Olympics, 1984 Olympics, and um, the doctor I ended up working for, Leroy Perry, was a chiropractic orthopedist, and he had just started this place called the International Sports Medicine Institute in West Los Angeles, and this is where a lot of the Olympic athletes, Olympic level athletes, were coming to get treatment and
Mm.
help as they were moving towards trying to get on the U.S. team for '84, and so it was really a very rich learning experience for me, and also culturally to be in Los Angeles at that time. It was the beginning of the fitness industry, really, as we know it today because the running craze had been happening for a while, but a lot of things came together at that time and in that place in the early to mid 80s. Not the least of which was the invention of Nautilus equipment, which allowed your average person off the street to safely work out with weight resistance just by
Mm.
moving a pin and selecting plates instead of carrying plates and putting them on a bar. And free weights
Right.
are kind of dangerous. um, so that was happening. Group fitness was ramping up because Jane Fonda's thing was
I
going on.
remember I had
Yeah,
her tapes.
yeah.
Yep.
Well, if you still look at those tapes, you'll see the difference between the first and the second one. There's all these biomechanical corrections that are coming in to the language of
Wow.
her second tape. And the reason for that was that people were getting hurt. And we saw some of the very first
Mhm.
aerobics injuries because her studio was just down Motor Avenue from where we were.
Mm.
Uh, and they didn't know they were the floors were carpeted and they didn't have the right
Yeah.
shoes. People were wearing running shoes to do these aerobics workouts. People were spraining ankles and injuring their hips and lower back. And then Jane came in and her back was all messed up from doing her own workout. And my boss, Leroy Perry, helped her fix her back. And he gave her some suggestions for how not to hurt yourself when you're doing aerobics. Like, don't run in place. You have to disperse the impact by moving forward or backward, simple things like that. But if you go
Mm.
back and look at those two tapes, the first and the second one, you'll see that she was having conversations with someone about biomechanics. And that was my
Wow.
boss, Leroy Perry. And so we were like at ground zero of and the whole Gold's Gym thing was happening. A lot of these bodybuilders were coming in. So it was a very rich time to be a fly on the wall, which is what I was, and I was learning an enormous
Mm.
amount about anatomy and biomechanics
Mm.
and rehabilitation strategies and all of that. So that's
Mm.
where I really cut my teeth on anatomy in
Mm.
those years leading up to the Olympics.
Wow. And then what? Because I know that you're a student of Desikachar. How did Desikachar come into the picture?
Well, I met him in 1988, so that was a few years after that. I came back to New York um, once the Olympics were over, and I started working for a dance medicine specialist who was actually an osteopath, a guy named Richard Backrack, who was very well known in the dance community. And so it was a somewhat similar situation to the sports medicine thing, but now more of a focus on dance. And
Mm.
there were a lot of very gifted people working for Richard that I learned a lot from as well, and made a lot of connections in that community. And so that was sort of what I was doing when I came back to New York. And eventually, I just started my own private practice because all along the way, I had been learning how to do body work, uh,
Yeah.
fascial release techniques, using my hands, all of it influenced by my background and interest in yoga. I
Mm.
ended up focusing a lot on people's breathing as part of what we were helping them with. And so this was all sort of going on for me by the time I met Desikachar. I also had my first
Mm.
yoga studio by the time I met Desikachar, which I started in
Really?
1987.
Where
Uh,
was that? What was that?
that was called Yogatone, and it was in the East Village on 4th Street between A and B.
Gotcha.
It was at a place called the Rap Art Center, which is a former Catholic parochial school. Um, and there was this really cool dude with really long hair in the base, not in the basement, on the first floor. I was on the third floor, and he had this t-shirt printing business. And we discovered we had a lot of interests in common, including yoga. And that was Eddie Stern. So
Oh my gosh.
yeah. So I knew Eddie before he was a yoga teacher from that
Wow.
context.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah.
That's so funny. So yeah, so you were doing private practice body work. I mean, people might not know this, but you are an incredibly skilled body worker. I mean, I didn't know that you did body work. I was just like, you're a yoga person, but I had no idea. And I vouch for your
Oh, that's sweet.
amazingness.
Yeah, it's
It's
been
true.
fun the times I've been able to take out the table and work on, like, you and Gil and whoever else was around and all of
Yeah.
that. Um,
That's so
so yeah. And by the way, for those of you that don't know, Eddie Stern turned out to be one of the most influential Ashtanga yoga teachers here in New York. Because to see what happened in New York,
Mm.
basically 10 years after this whole fitness thing was going on in LA, was the whole yoga thing started happening. And that was really kind of a merging of yoga teaching with the fitness industry, because
Mm.
Ashtanga was a way to get a workout. You know,
Yeah.
people didn't associate yoga with sweating or working very, very hard physically or this constant movement until this influence of Ashtanga Vinyasa came in. And in New York, which was ground zero for some of that, along with Los Angeles as well, because you had Jiva Mukti here on the East Coast,
Mhm.
and you had Yoga Works on the West Coast, and they were both very much connected with the Ashtanga Vinyasa as taught by Patavi Joyce, going back to the whole Krishnamacharya lineage, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the celebrities who were studying Ashtanga, who were based in New York, like Sting and Gwyneth and um,
Mm.
uh, you know, a bunch of other people, Madonna, of course, they were studying with Eddie, and then I was getting all these body work referrals from
Right.
those channels. So it was a real interesting time, and for me to have been present, you know, for both sort of points of inflection, basically 10 years apart, was kind of interesting.
Mm. So it sounds like before Ashtanga sort of came over, that yoga would have been, I guess, more breathing, more gentle, more flexibility.
More traditional hatha yoga kind of approach. And there
Yeah.
was always Iyengar. Iyengar has
Yep.
been taught in the States since, the 50s, really. And so there was always that happening. But when it really exploded, it was when the fitness industry wanted this way of teaching yoga in the clubs. And this is
Right.
actually what led to the conversations. Talk about another point of inflection, because that's what led to us sitting down and having to figure out the 200 and 500 hour standards. Because when the clubs wanted yoga, you know, there was this time, believe it or not, when the demand for yoga teachers far exceeded the supply. And who
Impossible. What?
Well, yeah. And who steps in with a brilliant business model but Beth Shaw, right?
Mm.
And that's Yoga Fit. And she became
Yeah.
famous by training yoga teachers in a single weekend, which
Right. And
which you
it's
could
still going
do.
on, right?
Well,
It's still
well, her trainings are longer than that now, and she has a yoga therapy training too. But the initial business model was quite brilliant. It was like, look, You have people who know how to lead group fitness. They're called aerobics teachers. They're already on the payroll,
Right.
give them to me for a weekend and they'll be teaching yoga on Monday and you can have it on the schedule. And so that's how Yoga Fit was born. It was brilliant. I mean,
Mm,
there was a gap between demand and supply and she figured out a way to fill it. But it got people like us sitting down and saying, hey, we're pretty sure a weekend isn't long enough to train a
right.
yoga teacher. How long should it be?
Right.
And then
Yeah.
we started having these meetings. And
Yeah.
I
So
was
who's
present for that
we?
too.
Because this is like the beginning of
Well,
Yoga Alliance.
yes. Well, I had been serving at that time as the vice president of a group called Unity in Yoga, and Unity in Yoga was putting on these big conferences where teachers from all different paths and traditions were coming together and presenting.
Mm,
And we did that um, from sort of like the mid 80s to the mid 90s. And that's when Yoga Journal stepped in and started producing conferences. And so
right.
Units in Yoga kind of went inactive at that point, but still
Mm,
existed as a nonprofit. But because all the teachers had been coming together at Unity in Yoga, this is when these conversations started about how many, should there be an industry-wide standard for, or at least a minimum standard for the training of yoga teachers. And it was because of what Beth Shaw was doing with Yoga Fit, but it was also because yoga was being introduced into more therapeutic environments, like through the Ornish program, for example,
mm,
and so the people responsible for designing the yoga component of the Ornish program were active members of Unity in Yoga. It was Yanni Chapman and Nishtala Devi, and
mm,
so they were going in and helping the Ornish program get installed in these various locations around the country. But like, who were the yoga teachers, the local yoga teachers that were qualified to come in and be trained to teach in the Ornish program? How do you find them? There's no
right.
directory. There's what? Yellow pages? And how do you know what their training was
Mm,
like? Well, you have a conversation with them and you establish a relationship with them. But people in medical environments, they like to see letters after people's names. They like, that sort of way
yeah.
of establishing some credibility. And so there was pressure coming from that side of the conversation as well as the fitness side, you know. And this was before
Mm.
IAYT had anything like standards,
Yoga therapy. Right.
Yeah. So so people got together at Unity and Yoga conferences, having the discussions. It turned into what is now referred to as the ad hoc committee. I was part of I think, the final meeting of the ad hoc committee. Um, and there were representatives
Mm,
like Ramananda was there from
mm,
Integral, and Rich McCord was there
mm,
from the Ananda sort of, that's more of a Yogananda thing. Rama Birch, who became the first president of Yoga Alliance, was
mm.
there, and a handful of others. And so we came up with these numbers based on previously existing, like Shivananda. If you take the month-long Shivananda training and break down the hours and topics, okay, and add them up. Basically, it's 6 days a week because we got one day off, times four, times the number of hours you spent in anatomy or philosophy or
Yeah.
practice teaching. It comes to pretty close to 200 hours, and that was the back of napkin calculation I still have the piece of paper where I figured this out and times it by four. And it's like, oh, this is about 200 hours. So that's what it was.
Mm.
And then it's like, okay, there should be a more advanced one. And then it was the 500. And
Here
that's,
we are. Here
yeah.
we are.
And here we are. Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. It's so fascinating to hear all these things come come into be, you know. It's like now 200 and 500 is like that's just what everybody knows. But there was a time in the
And the
not too distant
thousand
past.
for yoga therapy. Don't forget that
Yeah.
IOIT did jump in to the conversation starting in 2009 when we had the
Yeah.
Council of Schools, which I was always also present at, which was in Los Angeles in advance of one of their Sitar events. And that's when the conversation started about kind of standards for yoga therapy training programs.
Yeah. Yeah, that I remember. I was in the yoga world enough to kind of, I mean, I wasn't part of those conversations at all, but I remember the beginning of yoga therapy and
Yeah.
kind of like hearing about that and different, what were the credentials going to be. And wow, that's so fascinating. All right, so let's go
And
back
circling
to,
back to the tradition in Desikachar,
yeah.
the two founders of IAYT, of course, Larry Payne and Richard Miller, both students of Desikachar. So a huge influence on the conversation that we have now called yoga therapy is our teacher Desikachar.
So how did you meet Desikachar and what attracted you to his teaching?
Um, I I read an article in Yoga Journal, and this would have been in 87, I believe, that uh, uh, David Frawley had met Gary Kraftsow when they were both in Maui at the same time. And the result was this article about Gary and the work he was doing. And the things that Gary was quoted as saying and the principles that he was operating off of were eerily similar to things that I had sort of figured out on my own, with the focus on breathing that I had developed both through the body work and my experience as a yoga teacher. Um, Now, I
Mhm.
had heard of Desikachar prior to that because Larry Payne was the one who told me about Desikachar back in, it must have been like 1981, because he had just recently met him for the
Mm.
first time. And I became friends with Larry when I was in Los Angeles, and he had just started his place called Samata in Marina del Rey. And so, he had met with a lot of the luminaries of yoga on a recent trip to India. But he told me he was most impressed with this guy named Desikachar, and that was the one name I had not heard before. I had heard of Iyengar. I had heard of, the Kavalyadam in Lonavala. I had heard of, the Sai Baba and all the people. He'd been all over, but I'd never heard this name Desikachar. And he said, well, he's Krishnamacharya's son, and he does therapeutic yoga, and he teaches one-on-one. And I said, well, what impressed you the most about him? And Larry said, he teaches that it's all in the breath. And I didn't get much more than that. And I don't think Larry had gotten much more than that at that point. But it intrigued me, um, hearing it's all in the breath. And that was part of what was responsible for me really starting to pay attention to the way people were breathing when I was teaching and trying to give more sophisticated breathing cues to people as I was leading them through asana classes. And so that combined with the body work, by the time we hit 1987, and I hear these things Gary is saying in this article, it's like, I should meet this guy, Gary. So how do I do it? Well, I called Hawaii. I forgot about the time zone difference. So the call went in at some ungodly early hour there. Um, so I left a message, and I got a call back actually from his wife, Mirka. And it was not practical for me to go to Hawaii and study with him, but she told me Gary was going to be coming to California to present at what? A Unity in Yoga conference. That's how I got connected with Unity in Yoga. I went there just to meet Gary and
Hmm.
pick his brain and see what he had. And I did. And I was annoying and I asked a lot of questions and he was very gracious, about answering them. And he told me that his teacher, Desikachar, was going to be that next summer in 1988 at Colgate University. So by the time I met Gary, it was the beginning, like I think it was January of 88. So that summer, Desikachar was presenting at Colgate University, which is just north of New York, in upstate New York, in Hamilton, New York, at a public seminar, and that I could sign up for it. And so I did. And that was when I first met Desikachar in the summer of August of 1988.
Wow. So yeah. So for those out there who don't know, Desikachar being Krishnamacharya's son is significant. Krishnamacharya being the teacher of Mr. Iyengar and Patabi Joyce and Desikachar, which are three of the big influences, at least in my world of hatha and vinyasa, like those are the big three.
Hmm.
Um, so what was it like? So what was it like to meet him? And
It
because
was,
it's
it was,
interesting
it
that you,
was, yeah, it was inspirational and it was incredibly disruptive. Because he had a unique way of teaching breathing, as you know. There's this
Mm,
pattern that is very characteristic of his technique, which is to experience the inhale as a movement that starts at the top and moves downward, right? As opposed to the way it's usually taught, which is first the
right.
belly, then the rib cage, and then the top of the chest. And that's what I had been taught in Shivananda, and that's what I'd been teaching my students and teaching the teachers I was training at that point to do. And so I was deeply invested in this pattern. And so, after a lot of resistance, when I actually consented to try his pattern, it screwed me up for quite a while. So it
Mm,
was disruptive, but it was also inspirational in the sense that okay, this actually does work better for me after the disruption part. You know,
mm,
after I got through that, and then my anatomical curiosity kicked in. Is like, okay, why? Why do certain breathing patterns work better for certain people than others? What's going on anatomically with the rib cage, with the muscles that create the shape change of breathing, the diaphragm and all the other muscles? And so because Desikachar didn't really teach from an anatomical perspective, all my anatomical questions to him went unanswered. That's not how he learned it from his father. Um, they're much more on the side of Ayurveda and the whole energetic anatomy of yoga and, the chakras and the nadis and all of that. So, and so I started bugging Gary again with anatomical questions. And, I got a little more information, some basics, which was important, but nobody, as it turned out, was as obsessed with the anatomy as I was, at least in Desikachar's senior students, who, I annoyed a lot of them actually. And so, I just decided that I had to, kind of work on it and figure it out. And a lot of that process is what showed up in the breathing chapter of Yoga
mm,
Anatomy.
yeah.
Um, and again, as a body worker, there's this sort of hands-on experience that I have of having conducted at this point, I think over 20,000 hours of
Mm,
individual body work and yoga sessions with people. So you know, that's a big factor in how I understand the body
mm.
and how I teach about the body.
Oh, it's so interesting to hear that you were interested in the breath from earlier, and then it was kind of
Mhm.
like you were fascinated by it from your early body work days, and then this was just another, I guess, another facet to that or another way to explore it. So just to kind of digress a little bit, I'm just
Sure.
curious because Krishnamacharya is such a legend, like this, he's just a legend. And are there any stories that Desikachar told about him or anything that you know about him that you'd want to share with folks out there? Because this guy is like, I mean,
Well, he told lots of stories. In fact, I was part of getting. I should have had this on my desk so I didn't have to get up and reach for it. But I was part of getting this book published.
yeah, I have that book up on my desk stand right now, actually.
Yeah, well, this is the original hardcover edition, which doesn't exist anymore. It's completely out of print, and I have, I think, the last two copies up there. I had three, but I gave one to Desikachar's sister when I was in India just last month. Um, uh, so yeah, Krishnamacharya has two surviving children at this point. He had six. Okay,
Mm,
um, so the oldest and the youngest daughter are the two surviving children at this point. And I met with Sri Shubha, who's the youngest daughter. Um, and it was really quite a touching couple of hours where I actually visited her in her home and had some really lovely connection and discussion about just yoga and her family and her brother, my teacher, and all of that. So Desikachar spoke about his father constantly and told a lot of stories. And for the first time, the life story of his father was told in this book. Um, and uh, in the intervening years, this was published in, I think, 1998. Um, uh, was it 98? Or was it 80? Well, I'd have to check that. Anyway, um, probably earlier than that. Anyhow, some of the historical facts around Krishnamacharya's life are shrouded in a certain amount of mystery because different versions of his life story have been told with different dates and different years assigned to some of the critical junctures in his life. Um, Probably the most detailed critical analysis of that timeline appears in David and Gordon White's book about the Yoga Sutras. He wrote a biography of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and in chapter
Mm.
12, he discusses the what he calls the strange case of T. Krishnamacharya. Um, and so there's at this point there's sort of hagiography, you know, going on where you sort of are retrospectively looking at someone's life and elevating it to the level of myth in a sort of worshipful way, which is understandable because he was such a significant and in some ways mythic figure. Um, the key thing I gather from his life, which still, in spite of whatever historical inconsistencies in the timeline or tall tales that have been told about his life, um, what really does stand out is that Krishnamacharya, was born into uh, sort of the most lofty Brahmin family on the historic and religious side you can imagine in South India. You know, I'm not sure if it was his grandfather or his great grandfather. I've actually heard it described both ways, but um, uh, one of those was the head of the Prakalamat, which is this huge temple complex in South India, dedicated to the worship of Vishnu. And there's a lot of history around that. And so to be the head swami of the Praklamat is sort of like being the Pope of South India for this sect of Vaishnavism, right? And Vaishnav, you know, they're the ones who put the marks on vertically, as opposed to the Shaivites who put it this way.
Mm.
And how you put the mark on tells you which particular caste of Vaishnavism you belong to. So anyway, he was offered that post based on his scholarship and all of the degrees in Indian philosophy that he earned in the first part of his life. He was an incredible scholar and master of Sanskrit and all six darshanas of Indian philosophy, because there's six systems, and so he mastered all of them and could argue for each point of view against all the others
Mm.
depending on the situation. So he was one
Wow.
of these guys, you know, and so he could have had a very, very comfortable, revered life where he would be in this position of religious authority, you know, over thousands and thousands of people in his caste. And he's a direct descendant of a very significant saint, you know, who lived 900 years ago named Nathamuni, you know, and
Mm.
it's not just his religious tradition, it's his family, right? And he gave all of that up to be a yoga teacher,
Mm.
which is not at the time, we're talking about in the 20s, the 1920s. This is not
Right.
a prestigious thing for a person to do. In fact, it was quite the opposite, right? And so what was it about him and his character and his interests and what he decided to dedicate his life to, you know, that would have him make that choice. Now, the myth says it was a promise he made to his teacher, Sri Rama Mohana Brahmachari, the mythical teacher who was supposed to have lived in a cave in Tibet, who probably wasn't in Tibet, who might have been in Muktinath, or who, according to Bobby Joyce, was living in the forest outside of Varanasi. You see, it gets a little
Mm.
muddled, the geography and the timeline. But
Right.
as payment for the teachings he received, it's called Guru Dakshina. It's a very strong tradition in India. You know, you don't ever refuse whatever payment the teacher demands as the price of the teachings you receive. And so the price that was demanded of Krishnamacharya, according to legend, was you go back to your life, you go back to South India. His teacher knew about him and his family and, his studies and the degrees he earned and all of this. And he said, you marry, you raise a family, and you teach yoga. That was the price he demanded for the teachings, which was the highest price you could possibly demand for someone that was on the fast track to become the Pope of South India, right? So
Hmm.
that to me is the most fascinating story about Krishnamacharya. All the other historical and geographical inconsistencies
Wow.
aside, this is a man who could have had a very, very different life, but he would have been a swami. He would not have had children. Desikachar would never have been born. Iyengar
Yeah.
wouldn't have happened. He would never
Yeah.
have married Iyengar's sister, right? That's how Iyengar got trained. That's why he was living in Krishnamacharya's house in Mysore, because his older sister was Krishnamacharya's wife, right? So none of that would have happened. Just imagine what our world or our lives would look like had Krishnamacharya remained on that path that he was born into, you know, and not diverged from it by taking this very low caste position as a yoga teacher, where he struggled financially for many, many years until he became the beneficiary of the patronage of one of the richest men on the planet, the Maharaja of Mysore in the 1920s.
Oh,
Yeah, right. So
okay.
it's an incredible story any way you cut it.
It is. It's pretty epic. It
Yeah,
does feel
it should be a
mythological.
movie like by directed by David Lean or something, with the scope of it. It's like Lawrence of Arabia type storytelling would be required
Yeah.
to really cover this 100 years of this man's life. Yeah,
Wow. So Desikachar was his son and studied with him. But it's okay.
yes,
So what's crazy too about the story of Krishnamacharya is that the three students that, and I guess Indra Devi we could put in there too.
sure.
But
Yeah,
Iyengar, Patabi Joyce, Desikachar, the styles, if you will, that they have transmitted are
yeah,
so different. So that tells us something about Krishnamacharya as a teacher too, that it was not one thing. You know,
yeah. Well, in the case of Iyengar, you could make a case that he did not really receive a tremendous amount of detailed teaching from Krishnamacharya. And what training he did receive was geared towards turning him into an asana performer, a
right.
demonstrator, right? And that was the interest that Krishnamacharya showed in his brother-in-law, because at a
Mhm.
certain point, the young boys that had been training with Krishnamacharya and doing these demonstrations for him at the behest of the Maharaja, yoga
Mhm.
demonstrations were very, very popular then because there was a political undertone to them, because of the whole movement towards independence at that point to free themselves from British rule. Yoga was part of demonstrating that Indian culture and traditions had value, you know, uh,
Mm.
as fitness and health and all of that. And so the demonstrations that Krishnamacharya was enrolled in doing required him to show that he had students. He could have demonstrated anything he wanted. He was a very
Mm.
adept yogi, obviously. And in fact, he could do poses that Iyengar was never able to master, like Mula
Wow.
Bandhasana. Well, Mula Bandhasana, look it up in Light on Yoga. He's halfway there, right? Um, so, but all these young boys that had been studying with Krishnamacharya, one by one, ran away. because his teaching style was so abusive.
Yeah.
And so once the last of them, Keshavamurti, ran away, um, the only kid who was left, who had nowhere else to go, was Iyengar, who was in poor health, terrible student,
Mm,
had no prospects, was only living there by grace of the fact that his sister was married to this
mm,
scholar, this impressive yogi whose boss was one of the richest men on the planet. And so that's when Iyengar was trained by Krishnamacharya. And the famous stories about how his hamstrings were torn, being forced into Hanumanasana and things like that, that those things
mm,
happened. And so it was when Iyengar escaped and developed his own life as a teacher in the north, in Pune. That's when Iyengar yoga started being
mm,
developed, when he devoted just hours and hours and hours every day to his practice and healing his body and developing his own approach. It was
mm.
certainly influenced by Krishnamacharya, but that's not the way Krishnamacharya was teaching at that time. That's more like what Patabi Joyce picked up, or in the case of Indra Devi, this is a white woman who,
Yeah.
you had a very different context and body and starting point from someone like Patabi Joyce. You know, it was again, what was the situation for each of these people, and what was the intent for the teachings? In the case of Iyengar, he needed to turn him into a performer,
Mm.
and Iyengar did thousands of demonstrations over the course of his life. You know,
I think there are still videos of those out there somewhere, aren't there? Like on
yes,
YouTube or
of course,
something. You check it out.
sure.
So let's talk about Desikachar and this and the kind of
Hmm.
so I don't know that style is the right word, but some of the principles of that practice. Now, does it even have a name? Because I knew it like was it Vinny
Yeah,
yoga? It doesn't,
that's a bit of a tricky question.
yeah.
Um, First of all, let's point out the timeline, because when all of this
Yeah.
is happening in Mysore at the Shala, at the Jagan Mohan Palace, right? 1930s,
Mm,
right? Uh, the mid 1930s is when Iyengar was getting whatever training he was getting from Krishnamacharya. It was around that time also, that Indra Devi and Patabi Joyce received their instruction. My teacher, Desikachar, wasn't born until 1938, right?
right.
So he didn't even exist when all of this stuff was happening. So it was when independence came to India and the
Mhm.
Maharajas lost their power and lost their wealth, and the Shala finally closed in 1950. By 1952, Krishnamacharya had moved with his family to Madras, Chennai. It's now
Mm,
called Chennai, and so at that point he was much more in demand as a healer, and so was working with people much more one-on-one, using his skill in Ayurveda and everything else he had learned to help people heal. And so
mm,
this was much more of the context of yoga that the mature Desikachar experienced. And that's what motivated him to study with his father. He wanted to understand how yoga could heal people.
mm. Wasn't he an engineer, like
This is another
by
case of
vocation?
someone whose life path was really disrupted by yoga, because he was on the fast track to become a very successful structural engineer. And he had actually secured a very good position with a prestigious firm as an engineer, and was visiting home before embarking on this new job, and had an experience of seeing the power of yoga to heal people, that his father had, and it struck him so um, uh, deeply that he abandoned his career as an engineer,
Mm,
undertook the study of yoga with his father, which was not easy. He made him get up at ungodly hours and learn the chanting and the texts and the sutras and all of that. And it was he put him through the mill. He wasn't abusing him like he was back in the 20s and 30s with these kids. He had softened a little bit by then, from all accounts, but he still didn't make it easy on
So Desikachar came and taught, and other people. So you studied with him. Obviously, Gary Krafthouse studied with him. Mark Whitwell did Mark Whitwell study with him too?
Yeah,
Mark
exactly.
did.
Mark
Yeah.
Whitwell, not only did Mark study with Desikachar, but he is the one who helped turn the book Religiousness in Yoga into the book we now know as The Heart of Yoga.
Yes.
So
That's on my
that
shelf
was the big
somewhere.
project that Mark was doing when I met him in the 90s. In fact, he stayed with me in New
Right.
York for a while he was working on that book project. You got The
Just
Heart of Yoga right there. There it is. Yeah. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was from my first teacher training,
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
book.
Hmm.
Yeah. So so we hear Iyengar yoga, we hear Ashtanga. Those kind of like have names attached to them, but
Oh yeah, back to
it's
that.
yeah, just we don't
Vini
have a
Yoga
name.
is the term that was being used as sort of the brand name of Desikachar's yoga. In fact, it was Desikachar's suggestion that Gary call his training, American Vini Yoga Institute. Um, so, and the Europeans had been using it for years, and they still do. And then in 2003, a letter went out to everybody, which reportedly was authored by Desikachar, which now it seems more likely was written by his son Kaustubh, or at least influenced by him, which asked people to stop using the term Vini Yoga. Um, and, I took it at face value. I had never been deeply invested in the term. Um, and so we just called, from that point on, what we teach, individualized breath-centered yoga. So without branding it, but describing it in as few words as possible, I would call it that. That was what Desikachar taught,
Mm.
individualized breath-centered yoga.
So when we feel our way into, or kind of take a step back and look at yoga in North America and what people think of as yoga, it seems as though some of the influence of Desikachar's work can be found in obviously yoga therapy and breath-centered practices,
Hmm.
more personalized work. Is there any other places that we feel that kind of in our
Sure.
definition of yoga?
Chanting is very,
Chanting.
yes. Hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was a traditional Vedic chanting. Let's just be specific. Because when you say chanting, you could mean sitting in a room with, 200 other people and Krishnadas on stage, right? And that is a very interesting history to trace too. You should talk to Krishnadas as part of this, and he'll tell you how he showed up in 1994 at Jivamukti here in New York to one of their satsangs because he needed to chant with other humans. And
Mhm.
I missed him by a few months. I had left Jivamukti just before that started happening. So there was a few years of this friendship I have with Krishnadas, which could have been longer. We,
Ah,
we eventually got together, and that was inevitable. Um,
yeah.
yeah. In fact, I think I'm going to go watch the Super Bowl this year at his house again. So
Oh, really? Fun.
yeah, well,
You know,
we're
Gil
we're
was
we're sports fans as well as yoga buddies.
what? You
Anyhow,
have a life outside of yoga? Say it ain't so. You know, Gil
yeah,
was just
we
listening
all
to,
try
yeah.
to, yeah. Um, but chanting, the traditional Vedic chanting, because one of the contributions that actually should be mentioned of Krishnamacharya was he, going against the tradition, permitted Vedic chanting to be taught to women. And wouldn't you know it, the women took up that um, practice and in a big, big way. And now some of the most significant practitioners and teachers of Vedic chanting, of course, are women, and deeply
Mm.
influenced by, of course, Krishnamacharya, who opened the field to women, and Desikachar, who continued that by establishing Vedavani, which is the sort of separate institution from the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram, the KYM in Chennai, that teaches Vedic chanting.
Did not know that.
Mm.
That is that's that's interesting to hear. So I just want to say, like, Leslie, I could talk to you for days and days and days, and I also want to honor your time. I would say, so since it's now individualized breath-centered practice, if somebody wanted to explore this style, like, how do they find someone who teaches this style of yoga? Like, what do you do?
Well, there's senior te I'm junior, to just about everyone else that I know in this tradition. I'm a little bit of a latecomer, and I have not spent nearly the number of hours in the presence of Desikachar as some of my friends and colleagues who also teach. But you would seek out someone like Gary Kraftsow. You would seek out someone like in the UK, Paul Harvey. I believe that Claude Marechal is still teaching. He's actually older than Desikachar. He's Belgian, and there's many people in the UK. In fact, they get together for conferences. Ranju Roy, for example, um, uh, is one of them. There's organizations. They're not hiding, and they're not as sort of prominent and flashy as the stuff that became a lot more popular. That's more sort of Ashtanga influenced and all of that. But they're around. We hosted a get together with a bunch of them in 2018 at Kripalu.
Mm,
Um, Lydia and I produced this event to honor what would have been Desikachar's 80th birthday. So Mark Whitwell was there, Gary Kraftsow was there, Mirka, his ex-wife, was there, um, Larry Payne was there, Richard Miller, of course, the founder of iRest and one of the founders
mm.
of AYT, and who else was there? Sriram was there, who lives in Germany, very prominent teacher, student of Desikachar's. Um, and of course, Navtej Johar was there, another Indian teacher who was splitting his time between the States and and India. Navtej also became the most famous homosexual in India because his name was on the court case that got the Supreme Court to finally take that law outlawing homosexuality off the books. Uh, and that happened toward the end of 2018. In fact, he was in the middle of that court case when we saw him at that event. So he and his partner Sunil were the two prominent names. And Navtej
Mm.
is already famous because he's a very accomplished Bharatanatyam dancer. And a beautiful performer and teacher. And he's been doing his own thing for a while. So there's lots of people out there to study with Desikachar. But because we tend
Mm.
to focus on the one-on-one,
Right.
but we do teach group practice. You can definitely teach these principles in a group practice. There's no question. Desikachar did it. Um, we tend to be a little more in the nooks and crannies, and just working with individuals to help them with their breath, with their bodies, with their minds. A prominent teacher of the chanting is Sonia Nelson, who's based in New Mexico. Um, uh, Lots of folks out there.
Well, that's good. That gives people a start to think. That makes sense that since
We
it's
can attach links to all these people if you want to this. I'll
sure.
send you the info.
Yeah, no,
Have a list of people. Yeah.
it's real that's really nice because it's not, like you say, because it's not so flashy, because it's more one-on-one. It's people, I think it's it's not so well known
Well,
what
it
it's
used
all
to be
about
called
and who to
ugly
study
yoga.
with.
How about that? This
What
style
was it
used to be
called?
called ugly yoga. No,
Because it's
because like
all like
we modify, it's like there's no Vinny yoga calendar out there. There's like we'll do this thing. Well, where we bend an elbow or we bend a knee or we tuck an arm back or we use a chair or a block or a blanket or whatever. And
yeah.
so it's modified and it's individualized and it's not flashy in the sense that you wouldn't want to take a picture of it and be inspired, oh, to do that asana. Um, because, but here's the thing, when you're posing, when you're performing, and your goal is to make the pose look good for an audience, that's not always what serves your body, and your health.
Yeah.
Trust me, I know. I've I've
Mm,
I have directed photo shoots, asana photo shoots for books, and have been parts of demonstrations and video sessions and photo shoots and all of that sort of thing. And Iyengar famously, almost killed himself posing for Light on Yoga. Ask Dharma Mitra what it was like to produce that poster. You know
yeah. Yeah, they're scary, a little scary. Yeah. Even just holding, I've done photo shoots, of course, for just like mild things, never any of those crazy poses, but even just having to get into a warrior two where it sort of looks right, you're like, that's pretty
what looks
intense.
correct to the camera is not what feels correct to your body. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. If so Leslie, I'll
yeah.
ask one more thing because you are a treasure trove.
Okay.
So I have to say, yeah. So this has been such a fun conversation. Like it's so exciting to hear about all the history, the last 4 decades. I mean, you've seen so much of it, and it's just these are just wonderful, wonderful stories about the history of yoga and the different people who've been involved in it. It's extraordinary. Um, because I know you love the breath, if you were going to offer folks out there
Mm,
um, something they should be thinking about in reading or something to explore or a way of
mm,
thinking about their breath in the practice, what might you offer them or
mm.
suggest?
Well, I would um, I would frame the whole topic with with this, because confusion about this is what I think leads to difficulty for people. There's there's no right way to breathe. There's no correct way for your body to be breathing all the time. If you've been told that, moving your belly when your diaphragm is active on an inhale, moving your belly outward is the correct yogic diaphragmatic way to breathe, and you've sort of taken that to heart and automatize it, and now that's the way your body's trying to breathe all the time, you're stuck, right? So the practices in yoga are about getting unstuck. Now, how do you get unstuck? Well, you learn a technique. Belly breathing, like I just mentioned, is a technique, right? So is Kapalabhati, so is alternate nostril breathing, so is Bhastrika, right? So there is a correct way to do the techniques. That's what makes them techniques. And that's what we're learning. So don't confuse the fact that there's a correct way to do a technique with this technique, whatever it is that you've learned, is now the correct way to be breathing all the time, right?
Mm,
So that's important. And along with that, we learn the techniques because they help us get unstuck. So when you learn a new way to breathe, what it's really doing is it's confronting you with your old way of breathing. What are your habits? What are you stuck in already? Because we're all stuck in some way or other. This is just how we develop, you know. We all have habits. And so learning a new way to breathe forces us to unlearn our old way of breathing. And that's where the benefit is. And once you've mastered the technique, you move on and you try something else. Because one of my favorite sayings from Desikachar was, our yoga practice always has to be a little more clever than our habits, right? And so we always have to
mhm,
introduce something new, something different, something that we haven't already mastered to keep this tendency that we have to habituate ourselves from getting us stuck in our breathing habits. So I'd say I would wrap any conversation about the breath in that principle. There's no right way to breathe, but there is a correct way to do techniques. And we do techniques to help us get unstuck because when you learn a new way to breathe, it forces you to unlearn your old way of breathing. And you always have to keep it fresh somehow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Leslie, how can we find you? How can we find you and all of the amazing things that you do?
Um, yogaanatomy.org is my personal website with links to everything else that I do. And that's two A's, Yoga Anatomy, because there's another one with just one A, and it's not me. It's David Keel. Good guy, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, right?
Yeah, no, David. Okay.
Yoga
Yeah.
Anatomy.
Yoga Anatomy.
I'm
Yoga Anatomy.
Yoga Anatomy .org, and lots of exciting stuff in the online space, which you and I are going to be talking about
Yeah, we're going to talk about
at
it.
some point. Yeah. But we have the online courses at yogaanatomy.net. They're all linked to from that one website, and lots of stuff that will be sort of launching in the next year or so. So keep an eye on that space.
Yay. And of course, the book. Of course, the book, second edition or third edition. Go find it.
Third edition. Get the third
Amazing.
edition. It's better. Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie, so much. And everybody listening, go check Leslie's workout. You are just a vast font of information and amazing storytelling. And thank you
Thank you.
so much for taking the time to be here
Always a
today.
pleasure hanging out with you, Rachel.